Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday, parashat Vaera. Let's get down to our Torah lesson. This week's portion I want to focus on why the 10 plagues, what was the purpose of it all. In order to understand that, if we look at history, we see that there's a constant progression of advancement. We are going forward, we're constantly going forward. And obviously we can see it so clearly in technological advancements. I remember way back, I was the first one in Itamar to get a cell phone. My father was concerned living here with all the terrorism around us. So he bought me this phone, and I would have to carry it back. It was so heavy. In Israel, it's called a pelephone, the wonder phone. And as we know, the phones have gotten so advanced that they got smaller and smaller, lighter and lighter, till eventually we'd flip it out or have a Nokia, whatever it's called. And then we had the iPhones. Today, it's like walking around with a supercomputer in your hands. It's amazing how the world is going forward. And this is not only in the cell phone world, but of course, in the computers. We can see it in medicine, in science. It's unbelievable. Scientific world. The ancient theory of gravity would actually believe that the stars and all the planets are held in place through these crystals, these invisible crystals. Eventually, that gave way many years later to when a person named Isaac Newton came along and said, no, there's gravity. And Albert Einstein came along and said to Isaac Newton goodbye when he proved that the curvature of space-time, that's really what causes that's really the force behind gravity. So we see how the world is constantly moving forward and getting more advanced. And that is so clear, everyone sees it, wow, in science and medicine and all these areas. But they forget the most important thing is to see it also in the world progressing forward, the constant progression of the world and understanding God in the world. All about spirituality in the universe. And that is something that we also have to go and progress as time goes on as well. And here, the lesson of the 10 plagues in Egypt is all about that. If we look in history, we see these different empires that came and went. And each time something was happening in the world, God stirs up the world and is bringing the world to another leap forward. And it's getting closer to a rectified end-of-day world where the prophet Sfanya says that the entire world will speak one clear language, knowing God. At the end of the day, the whole world will be unified. And the purpose of the nation of Israel is to be a light to the nations, to be a roadmap, to watch the nation of Israel and see how through the nation of Israel, the world will be taught there's one God in the world and what God is all about, how God relates to man. Now, getting now to our portion in Egypt it was a very chaotic world, a world of idol worship. They were the empire, and they believed in gods, and there are many different gods. You can go and look. How many different gods were there in Egypt? You can check it out in Rabbi Google and see how many Egyptian gods there were. And to bring down some names, and actually wrote some of these names down, it's almost laughable. But I want to read a few of them. One was called Ra, was the sun god. One was Happy, which was the god of the Nile. But there was also Anuket, which was the goddess of the Nile. So they had the Nile for them was so powerful that they had two gods. And they had Set, which was the god of the storms, and Aten, whatever, I'm probably not pronouncing them right, was the god of the moon or the sun, whatever it is. We see that the different forces in nature, they turned into gods. And the Nile, which was their major source of livelihood, of sustenance, there's no wonder why they had even two gods for the Nile. And why? The Nile River, which began in Lake Victoria up there in Ethiopia, the White Nile, whatever, it would come down a stretch of 6,000 or so kilometers long and eventually pour water into the plants, and they can harvest them. It would give them a good yield. It would bring them also compost from all the good soil coming from the mountains. But if it was too much water, it would destroy the harvest. And if it was too little, it would cause a famine. As well, it would dry up. So they believed so much in this power of nature. The Nile is one of their powers. And if we look at the plagues, now getting to understanding why the plagues came in the world, there's a beautiful explanation given by a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was born in the year 1075, passed away in 1141. He was the great author of the book called the Kuzari. And his son-in-law, the Ibn Ezra, the famous commentary on the Torah, as a matter of fact, there's a crater named after him, of the Ibn Ezra. He was a great mathematician as well, and they named a crater after him. So the Ibn Ezra, he brings down, if you look in this week's portion, in chapter 9, verse number 1, he brings down an explanation of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi on the plagues. And he gives a very interesting insight, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He says that if you look at the first two plagues were the plagues of water, right? We can say the Nile River. It turned the blood and the frogs that came out of the water. So slowly, this is what I think I can add to this picture of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and say his explanation goes perfectly with the point I'm trying to make. Because in the beginning, God was educating the Egyptians and realizing, listen guys, wake up. There's someone in charge of, above your gods of the Nile. So God plagued them. 2 plagues struck the Nile. And the Egyptians, of course, could have right away attributed, we did something wrong, the Nile is all messed up. But then again, it went on. After the water, the next thing was the land, the lice, and the wild animals. They were on the land, they were causing the problems for the Egyptians. So that was the next plague. Now the land animals as well, the Egyptians had gods that related to the land. We know the jackal god, they had crocodiles, that was also from, but they had the different gods, the cat, we all know the cat faces of the Egyptians. So these wild animals and the kinim, these insects, were the next thing that God showed, that God is in charge not only of the Nile River, but he's above the land. And then came the other plagues. The plagues that came from the air, as we know. Plagues that come from the air, the dever, the dever and the shchin and the boils and the plague, they come from the air. So God was saying again, there was also an Egyptian air god, by the way. And then God was saying, I'm above that. And after the air, there was something beyond the wind, right? The wind and the clouds, which was, we know that, and the sun. So God began to bring plagues. For example, the barad, the hail that came down, which was a mixture of fire and water and ice. All that came down from the sun. Those were from the upper atmosphere, coming already down from a higher place. And God is saying, I'm above all that, above the atmosphere, right? And the arbeh, the locust, came also from the wind that brought the locust in from where it came from. So God was teaching the Egyptians through these plagues that Moses the prophet was saying, being the emissary to bring the plagues, God is way above these different forces that you all believe in. The Egyptians had a god, we mentioned before, of the sun, as we mentioned, what was his name? Aten, the sun god. So if that wasn't enough, God brought the plague of the darkness. Now the Egyptians had a god, which was a god of darkness as well. And here God shut out the light of the sun and shut out the light of the moon and the stars. So God was showing that there's a force that's above all that. And finally, the plague of the firstborn was something that went totally out of the universe. Something that had no natural explanation at all, because of something they couldn't understand. All of a sudden, the firstborn of all their families and nation were dying. And that showed that God is above, in every way above every possibility of nature. And again, the Egyptians have all these other gods relating to death and things like that. The point is that we see that there was a constant progression within Egypt. Through the plagues that God brought around was a way to educate the world, to show the world that there is a force that goes beyond nature. And that nature is totally controlled by one who created the universe, who could take nature and change nature. But God is above, of course, nature. That lesson was the lesson of the plagues in Egypt. If we follow history, and we can follow this pattern, is that to this very day we are still being plagued with the scientific viewpoint that there's some kind of one formula that could solve the riddles of understanding the workings of nature. So nature is a hard thing to rectify the world in letting the world realize that there's something above nature, the scientific world. There are many of those still trapped within that same Egyptian mistake. Instead of calling all the forces of nature, they again by different gods. So the science is trying to give a certain kind of equation that could solve the riddles of all of nature. But in reality, they're still looking at nature as all there is, the sum total of all forces in the world as nature. It's a similar kind of Egyptian philosophy, more refined. But that's the beauty of planting the nation of Israel, where God is going to show that the 10 plagues are going to become the 10 words of God, the 10 speakings of God, the 10 commandments, where there we see a direct revelation that God speaks directly to the world through the people of Israel, through the prophets of Israel. Every person of Israel heard the voice of God on Mount Sinai. That is again what Israel will continue to show the world throughout ages. That was the plan. That was the what's the word I'm looking for? In Hebrew we say the avtipus. That was the basic level. From there, as we follow Israel throughout history, we'll see how Israel will be the map of God in the world. Just look at Israel and we see how God talks to the nation of Israel. And that great lesson for mankind to show that God does not only create a world, but God is connected to the world, will always be taught through the nation of Israel. And that was this great lesson of the plagues of Egypt. Shabbat Shalom, let it be a lesson to all of us to constantly see the God in the world that relates to us. And the God, of course, there's one God in the universe that's above all the forces of nature. And we can find God. All we have to do is look for Him and seek Him, and we will find Him. Shabbat Shalom, B'Sarot Tovot, Yeshua Dechem.